we would love to go in, have the business partner say, here's my task, here's my baseline performance. Let's see if this is viable. If you can increase performance upon this baseline by X% or whatever.
Mhm.
I don't think I've ever seen an instance where that happens in real life.
You're listening to Gradient Descent, a show about machine learning in the real world, and I'm your host, Lucas Bewald.
Catherine Hume runs Borealis AI, which is the AI arm of the Royal Bank of Canada, and so she works on a slew of machine learning applications that we get into, but also she has a background in comparative literature and speaks Latin, and that's surprisingly relevant to the work that she does and to our conversation. And to find out why, you're going to need to listen to this one. All right, so why don't we start with what you work on? You see, you have like a really interesting job in an interesting organization. Maybe you could describe it and talk about what a day in the life is like.
Yeah, for sure. So I lead up a group called Borealis AI, which is the machine learning research lab for the Royal Bank of Canada. For those listening in the States or outside of Canada, you might not know of it, but it's actually the largest bank in Canada, and I think it's the 9th largest bank in the world. So it's a pretty big shop. There's like 90,000 employees in the company. And Borealis was founded in 2016 as just the the ML research center for the bank. And so day to day in my team, I think, like many other ML shops, we learned over the years that it takes more than just scientists to really make production ML systems work. So we've got a group of machine learning scientists. We have ML engineers who do a lot of the work in taking the code from the scientists and really building out production ML systems. We have product managers who do what product managers do, figure out what we should build and really collaborate to make sure we ship things on time. And then we have a group of business development experts who work with our business partners. So kind of in the bank, there's like mini markets, if you will. Mm-hmm. There's the retail bank, which works with people like you and I. So, checking accounts, savings accounts. There's wealth managers who help manage people's assets. And then there's capital markets, which is sort of the institutional investing. And so they partner with those various teams and help us find ML use cases. So yeah.
And could you describe what those use cases are?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll talk about some of the products that we've worked on and various use cases that we see. So it's a broad variety, I'd say, of applications. If we go into the retail bank, so things that are helpful for people like you and I, one of our recent applications was a cash flow forecasting application for day-to-day customers. So this is probably, there's lots of customers out there who have missed a bill payment or potentially overdrawn their account and gotten fees from the bank for having like insufficient funds in their account. Mm-hmm. So we built something that's trying to predict upcoming payments in the next 7 days. So we stuck at a target of about a week out to give people reminders that say, hey, this thing is coming. You might want to, either pay it now or take different kinds of actions in moving money from savings to checking, et cetera, to, be able to cover those expenses.
Wow, is that really live? That really works?
Yeah,
I've never gotten
live.
A message like that from my bank. Maybe I should switch banks.
It's live as of maybe a month ago we went into production, so it's really new.
Wow, how cool.
But yeah, that's one of the latest ones we put out. And it's an interesting ML problem because so if we think about ML models, they're going to take a series of time series data, things that you've paid in the past, and then try to generalize a prediction. So what's that going to look like in the future? But if you have something like, say it's your electricity bill, your phone bill, my phone provider decides every once in a while that they're going to increase my rate arbitrarily. And I don't know why this is coming, but it just happens. And it's like, it goes from, $75 a month to $85 a month. And I have to just pay that extra fee. So one of the cool things in our model was we needed to use an attention mechanism so as to basically not overgeneralize that trend, right? So it's like, it's not going to see that it's 75, 75, 75, 85, 85, and then imagine that 3 months later it's going to go to 95. We had to sort of correct for those kind of stepwise changes that a provider might make that, an algorithm might incorrectly generalize as a trend. So that was one of the many micro nuances to actually making this thing work.
That's cool. Like your energy bill might go up in the winter, or I guess in the summer if you're in a hot place, right?
Yeah, there's a lot with seasonality for sure. Yeah. And so you can't just take like the average trend over a year, or else you're going to end up with, I don't know, somewhere in the midpoint in September when it's actually, tend to be more stepwise. Yeah.
And can you talk about like how you came to make that? I mean, I guess I always assumed that banks kind of liked charging really high overdraft fees and would kind of want you to maybe do that. But I guess that's wrong. How did you kind of come up with that as like working with the business to know the business wants that, and then also realizing that's a feasible ML problem that you could actually solve?
I was actually quite proud of this. So at the Royal Bank of Canada, there's a little bit of like a, it might have to do with the Canadian banking mindset, but there's part of it is, be profitable institution, but then equal in part is sort of be like a good citizen, like be good to the Canadian citizens. And so slightly different than in some of the US environment in that the Canadian population is very, it's not underbanked. So underbank is a term that we use for people who are not within the sort of recognized banking systems. So like a Chase customer, a Bank of America customer, a Morgan Stanley customer. I think in the US, I don't know exactly what the statistics are, but it's something like 30-ish% of the population is actually not using a bank, like a registered bank. So they use things like payday loans and sort of like the sort of on the side type banking products. But in Canada, I think it's like 98% of the population actually is in the main banking community, which then has implications for sort of social responsibility from these pretty large institutions because you've got the whole population represented. So I think I found it quite promising that like the executives making the businesses executives making the decisions were felt that it would be better for customer loyalty to provide a service that helped versus like do this sort of nickel and diming on these kind of fees.
Uh-huh.
Finding the use case, it's always an iteration. So I think in the ideal, like coming from the academic ML world, we would love to go in, have the business partner say, here's my task, here's my baseline performance. Let's see if this is viable. If you can increase performance upon this baseline by X% or whatever. I don't think I've ever seen an instance where that happens in real life. And so it's more like, hey, we have this idea. What do you guys think? And then we're like, all right, let's play around with some of the data and see what we can find and see if like there's a there. And so we'll come and we'll say, all right, we think this is the task. And then, it's like, what time frame do you need? And so when we originally started this, I thought cash flow was like 6 months out. And then our partners were like, no, 1 week. And I was like, okay, well that helps. So there was sort of iterations on just narrowing down, the scope of the prediction, what qualified as decent performance. So I often find with the business, like the preferences, it's accurate every time.
That would be the preference.
It's absolutely, the preference is always like, actually, there's no machine learning involved, and this is just a rules-based system that works like clockwork. So then it's sort of iterations where it's, all right, well, what if, this edge case, the prediction is off? Like, how might that impact customer experience? And it's sort of like iterative negotiation to get to the point of, we're comfortable with this as like a starting point. And then there's sort of the selling and pitching and telling the story, getting the various people involved to get it to market. And I'd say with our group too, since we're a machine learning team, but we partner with other groups in the bank that do design, that do like just a lot of the sort of ticking the boxes around all the business processes. There's a lot of back and forth and stakeholder management to really get something live as well.
And what ended up, I'm just curious, what ended up being like the level of accuracy that you could get with that sort of 7-day prediction if, I'm going to overcharge my account?
It varied per payment type. So if you had a pre-approved payment, so like your Spotify, subscription or whatever, it was quite high accuracy and also the day that the payment would come out was quite high. So we had a multi-objective supervised learning algorithm that predicted the one task was how much and the second task was when. And so with those, it could get pretty high. I think within 3 days range, we were at, I don't remember, I think it goes down to like 88 or 89%. Within 3 days, it was up to 98. And if it were the exact day, it was more like 88, 89. So with those pre-approved, it was quite high. Once we got into things like loan payments, anything that's sort of an arbitrary e-transfer, like a Venmo payment, those are harder. Because there's just not a lot of like predictive, there's more variability. There's not that kind of like just standardization. So varied per payment type. But sometimes it was as high as like 98, and then it would skew down to about like in the high 80s.
And you were using a model that included attention. It sounds like a lot of machinery for this kind of problem. Did that really matter? Did it do much better than like a simpler baseline?
Yeah, it's a great question. I posed the same question to the team and being like, wow, this is a lot of machinery for this kind of problem. I think it came down to, again, the seasonal variability. It's like you'd imagine that it's something where it's like, it seems like it could just be a pretty standard approach. But yeah, just with these things that creep up like seasons, like variation in payment time for per individual. So some people are like, they've set up automated stuff and the minute it goes, it comes. Other people, they haven't, so they do it manually, and there'll be these like lags and when they pay. And so that has implications not only on this thing is due, but like how that impacts their balance. So once you get into the details, it becomes more messy and, needs more machinery. Yeah.
Can you describe some of the other applications that seems like such a surprising and cool but like what are kind of the main like bread and butter like bank applications of ML?
I want to talk about another cool one.
Oh yeah,
but before
right, cool
I want to do another cool one. I'll do a cool one first. Yeah. So another, this one is really artful because you have to scope it down really small, but it's cool. So it's using reinforcement learning for trade execution. So here's the problem. Imagine you're a big hedge fund and you trade every day, right? You just come into the equities markets and you're like, you order millions of orders of some sort of stock and you trade it through the day. So the question at hand is, you come in, you decide that you want to execute a million orders of Google shares over the course of the day. Stock market opens at 9, closes at 4:30. The question is, how do you distribute that order optimally throughout the day so as to achieve your desired returns targets? So there's a common historical algorithmic approach to solving this problem, which is called a VWAP algorithm. VWAP stands for volume weighted average price. So it's the average price of the stock throughout the day weighted by the volume that's traded, right? As the name suggests. I don't know when these kind of algorithms came into being, but I think they're like date back to the 90s or something.
Wait, so sorry to interrupt. That seems like it would be a number. How is that an algorithm?
It's a curve. It's a number, but it's a number. If you trace it throughout the day, that it'll change slightly, right? So the algorithm we took was, what trades do you place to hit that number?
Oh, I see.
Right. So and you can, like, I won't go into the complexities of how the limit order system works, but effectively think, do I sell, hold, or buy the stock, right? It's not exactly that, but I think for the sake of, like, we don't have to go into the arcane detail. You could buy or sell or hold, right? So this is where reinforcement learning comes in. You have a sequence of a couple of kinds of actions.
Okay.
You might sell, you might buy, but yeah, you're trading stocks during the day.
Okay. And so what would the simple algorithm be? Because you don't know what the stock price is going to be, right?
You don't know what the stock price is going to be, but the simple algorithm, from what I understand, is you've got historical price curves, how the stock performed yesterday, 2 weeks ago, a month ago, etc. So you'll use that to make a guess on how much you should buy at a certain time of the day.
Okay.
In order to achieve your target goals, the target money making goals that you have for the day.
Okay.
So the algorithm basically releases, like, buys or holds, right, or doesn't release, and it partitions that at timestamps.
Okay.
At 9 a.m. I'm going to do X at 9:15. What you don't want to do is say, if it's a large order, like a million orders of stock. If at 9 a.m. you say buy 1 million, that has a big impact on the market price, and it'll sort of shake things off, right? So you try to dose it,
right.
Just a little bit at a time. Without disrupting the ship, right? With keeping the market relatively stable, because you're one of the participants, but there's going to be however many others on the exchange at that time. So what we did here is we said, we're trying to hug that number, right? So the price number across these time stamps. What we said is, could we use reinforcement learning to optimally dose our buy decisions to stay as close as possible to that curve? So the value function was basically just minimize the distance. We can observe that number.
Sorry, the curve is the volume?
The curve is the average price weighted per volume.
It's the price weighted by the volume. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And you want the curve to do what?
What you want to do, there's a trading strategy where you want to hit that curve. So you want to sell or buy in such a way that the
It
price that you
matches.
arrive at matches that curve exactly.
And does it work?
Yeah, and the cool thing is it works. It works quite well even when there's a lot of volatility in the market. So in March of 2020, when COVID hit, it was just much more like volatile than the stock market normally was. And
Sure.
what was nice is it adapted. I don't know the exact time it took to adapt and like nonetheless get superior trading returns. It may have taken a day. It may have taken a couple of weeks. I'm not sure on that time frame, but I know that it adapted much better than like a standard trading algorithm would.
And I guess you're constantly retraining the algorithm then.
Constantly retraining the algorithm, and a different team, not our team now, but the team that now like owns that algorithm, are working on adapting the task to different kinds of trading styles. So not this hug that VWAP curve that I described, but there's other like approaches and strategies that one could take when trading.
Uh-huh.
And they're retuning it to see if it could work there. I think there's a lesson though in reinforcement learning, and that it's not, you can't just scale it to a new use case. It requires significant effort to write a new algorithm that will work with a different task. So
Right.
yeah.
Interesting. So what are the other kind of important applications to you?
Yeah, so other more bread and butter applications.
Or other cool ones, I guess, if you got other ones you want to talk about.
There's another cool one we could talk about down the line that's a little less related to banking. I like to think about it this way. So what does a bank do? A bank takes in money at one rate. So you put money in your checking and savings account, and it loans out money at a different interest rate, and it makes money on the spread, right? That's kind of basically what a bank does. That's there historically when banks have used models, statistical models, to decide how much they should lend to a given customer. There's plenty of background models that are using linear regressions, et cetera, to do this. But there's a lot of opportunities to sort of upgrade some of those decisions using ML with more data, different types of data, but sort of the basics of who should we give a loan to, how much should that loan be, what is the risk that the person that we incur that the person might default on this loan. If they do default, when should we call them? How like ranking that ordered queue. There's like process optimization. How do we have our call center. Very often we go into especially today we have digital banking. You go on, your password doesn't work. Something happens. You're stuck. You have to call somebody. There's a lot of applications in call center automation. The conversational AI work, automating some of that queue, rank ordering queues. Whose call should we take first to approach this? There's which product. Banks often have a series of products. Which product offering do we send to which customer next?
Mm-hmm.
Those are kind of more standard industry problems. I think that exists everywhere. It's not unique to banking. Sort of the like next best product offering optimization.
And do you work on all those problems? Your
We don't
team?
work on all those problems. No, we work
I see.
on we do a lot of work in credit, but there's other teams in the bank who work on various other data science problems like this.
Well, tell me about credit. I mean, that's something I don't know a lot about, but I do know that we've had various sort of like mortgage crises that I think were like, at least in the publicly available information seemed to indicate that it was like too much machinery kind of leading to bad decisions. Like, do you think that's accurate? And then like, how do you think about machine learning in that context?
Well, to be honest, I'm not. I'll speak on this from the perspective of somebody who was not a banking expert in the 2007 2008 credit crisis. Yeah, but I mean, so this whole collateralized debt obligations, right? It's like I think at the there's the tip of the spear, which is two people deciding to, like, let's say I decide to lend you $10, um, and I think about whether or not you're going to give that back to me, and I say, if he doesn't pay it, it's also okay, right?
Uh-huh.
All the way to you know I've got a set of mortgages and I'm a different institution who's going to hedge a strategy on some other institution's mortgages and I don't have insight into the quality of them. That's when you get into like the, these sort of layered risk management strategies. So when you go in terms of ML's engagement here, I think the big thing is the regulators have caught up. There's always the some action happens in activities, and then there's been a lot of regulatory oversight since 2007, 2008 to try to protect the economy by putting some limits on banks. Like there's a thing in Canada, we call it the CET1 ratio, um, which is a ratio that's used to manage the liquidity that a bank has, so sort of overall cash flow over risk-weighted assets. So these are something like a mortgage, right? The asset that a bank might hold that has some risk associated with it, and a bank has to manage that ratio in such a way that if something bad happens, there's still like relative stability. Um, if you think about adding an ML into this mix, right? So let's say we were to use ML to calculate that the risk factor in the denominator of that one equation. Um, they want a lot of transparency and explainability, right? So
Sure.
there's a lot of governance oversight that's like we're not just going to put in a black box neural network and see what happens. So there high need to select models for those kind of use cases that are quite transparent and audible and where you can clearly understand how input feature is leading to output.
Hmm. So what kinds of models do you end up using?
Varies per use case and context. So ranging from, like the cash flow one that I talked about is a deep LSTM. There's an LSTM backbone also in the reinforcement learning one for trade execution. Two, sometimes I'm not sure if my team has done much, but there's a lot of decision trees. You know what I mean? There's a lot of XGBoost models for some of the credit work. We have a governance tool that we've built that is optimized for decision trees
Hmm.
because there's a lot of models in the bank that use those.
And this is like a single tree or like a boosted set of trees?
Varies per use case again.
I see.
Yeah, yeah.
And I guess how do you, I mean, it seems like, probably a lot of applications, but like mortgages specifically has like kind of a long history of like, yeah, at least racial inequality. Like, how do you think about that? Like, how do you, are you able to kind of like look at the models and get some sense if they're being fair, and how do you even, define what fairness would mean?
Yeah, great question. We haven't done any work on mortgage predictions in particular, but we have done some work with credit, and we do fairness. There's a lot of fairness tests prior to putting a model into production. At the bank, there's a group called Enterprise Model Risk Management, and it's interesting. I don't actually know if there's like a preference for individual or group level fairness testing. I do know that there's a tool we've built that focuses on individual fairness.
And sorry, what would
Um,
that mean in individual fairness versus group fairness?
yeah, so group fairness is if you've got two groups where a group is defined by some similarity on a feature, right? Let's take the example of race, right? So you've got the black group and the white group. Um, the group level fairness is the error rate on the black group proportionate to the error rate on the white group for some prediction task.
Uh-huh.
Um, if you go into individual level fairness, it's like if you have a set of features that are similar to my set of features, then if I get a $5,000 loan, you too get a $5,000 loan. So we have tools, but I still believe there's a decent amount of subjective interpretation that goes into like, well, what aspects are we trying to calibrate as fair?
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
so
sometimes
yeah,
it seems to me with machine learning, it kind of forces us to be more clear about what we mean by fairness, and that can, that just the way it's like easier to kind of quantify, I guess, like the unfairness sort of leads to um, a lot of debate, right? Like, because it. I mean, how do you account for features that are correlated with like group group fairness, right? It seems like always like challenging, right? How, like to what does it mean to really prove that your model is being completely fair? It seems like a hard thing to rigorously define. Although I'm sure I mean, we should get people who thought about it deeply on this podcast for sure.
On the podcast.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It's the last I checked, there were 21 current interpretations, like technical interpretations of what fair means.
Wow.
So
Is there a
a lot
list
of,
somewhere? Do we have a link that you could you could give
yeah, I
us?
can definitely find it. There's a paper
Awesome.
from this is like from 2019. So maybe it's been, or something like that. But yeah, I definitely send the link after this call. And yeah, I've seen things like at the bank, there was one where, these proxy correlations, you might want to say we don't want to discriminate by gender.
Mhm.
This one for like sort of a business loan, I remember. And, but they kept in the business code type. So it was like restaurant, retail, manufacturing, blah, blah, blah. And one of them was beauty and spas.
Mhm.
And as it happens, I don't know, some very high percentage of the proportion in Ontario that are beauty and spa owners are women. So there's this
Mm.
proxy encoded. So they sneak up all the time, right? So I think it's
Right.
also kind of like, if you really dig into it, you can keep going and uncover these potentially unfair variables. So
Right. Right.
yeah.
Interesting. What I mean, I think we found some other interesting applications that you've talked about or your team's talked about, like a text to SQL database interface. Would you want to talk about that at all?
So yes, we built this tool we called Alan, which was a listening answering neural network, I think is what the acronym standard for in the beginning.
Nice.
But yeah, it's a text to SQL interface. So basically, user comes in, poses a question like, find the highest rated stocks in my portfolio or something like that.
Uh-huh.
And the system takes that query, goes into an SQL database, and one parses from a natural language utterance into something that's a little bit more structured, so it looks like a SQL field.
Mhm.
And then two can actually go and compute the operation and output an answer. So, Google is the stock that has the highest rated portfolio, whatever it was that I said is the potential question.
Right. Right. And so, how did you frame that even as a machine learning problem? Like how did you get training data? Did you view it as like an NLP, like a sequence to sequence model type thing, or how did you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. The person on the team who built it, Yan Shui, would be better equipped to answer it than I. But it was framed that way. So framed as a sequence to sequence mapping problem. When we started the application, transformers hadn't really taken off yet, but midway they had. And it ended up being sort of this, how can we adapt transformers to very small data sets? Because we have very small, like there's close to no training data mapping natural utterance to extremely structured like pseudo SQL. So we built this, we kind of bootstrapped this pseudo SQL database and had a bunch of labelers come in and be like, yes, this is what this. It was sort of a pick list. It was like, if you say this question, does it mean X, Y, or Z?
I see.
And they labeled the pick list, and we had that as our bootstrap training data set, and decided on the application because there's a lot of SQL databases in the bank, and in a lot of large enterprises, and often you've got like a handful of folks who are the analysts who are called upon to go and like do these queries and find answers. They'll build dashboards, like a Tableau type dashboard, where that's sort of like commonly posed questions. They're kind of like FAQs, right? Mm-hmm. Where it makes sense to automate, and like every month you see the chart. But our original hypothesis was there's probably lots of long tail questions that it doesn't make sense to program, but that would be really nice. But you also don't want to have sort of call in the data analyst to do the work on. So can we just have people ask those questions to the tools? Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I guess switching gears a little bit, I was hoping to hear a little bit about your career and how you came to this really interesting job. I mean, I think you talk about being coming up through humanities, although I think you do have a math degree, which is, a kind of a technical side of humanities. And then you did a grad school in comparative literature, right? Which is a little bit of an interesting switch, maybe. Although I feel like I had a couple friends in college that did math and comp lit, but I was always sort of struck by that. I wonder if you could talk about, kind of what you're thinking at the time and how that informs your work today.
Yeah, great. I'm glad you noticed that I also have a math background, because people often are like, how does, literature and then machine learning? And I'm like, yes, but I did do a lot of work in linear algebra, so at least I can imagine, functions. Yeah, it's a great question. I wish it were, I had a master plan, but I didn't have a master plan. I actually intended originally to be a physics and philosophy major. Those were the things that interested me most. And I was kind of a klutz in the lab. I really didn't like the lab. So I was like, you know what, none of this physics stuff. I'm going to do the part where you don't have to go into the lab and just do math. And then I always loved, though, humanities, and I spent my junior abroad in Paris, and I didn't have to take any math courses because I had enough sort of standing credits. So I took courses in philosophy, film, literature, and I really loved it. So yeah, decided to change my major my fourth year in college, and instead of just doing math, do a double major in math and comp lit. And the good thing about comp lit is that it's kind of, well, the good and bad thing. The bad thing is that it kind of lacks identity as a discipline. It's kind of like a grab bag of like, it used to be, if you like, so why comparative? It used to be, imagine you take a theme like love, and then you say, how do the French write about it? How do the Germans write about it? And you find these sort of cultural overlaps, which was the comparison. As the discipline has evolved, it's kind of become like, some people focus on, philosophy and literature. Some people do cultural studies. Some people do rigorous sort of history of a national literature. So the ambiguity was good for somebody like me, because it was kind of like, sure, you want to do math, history of philosophy, history of literature, languages, semiotic, great, great place for you. So I went into it. I really liked languages, and I thought it provided a lot of freedom to explore. I wrote my dissertation on 17th century epistemology, so basically what was knowledge at the time, and focused on Descartes, Leibniz, Newton, so sort of the old dead white guys, and
classic math guys.
Classic math guys, exactly. Yeah, I know a lot about 17th century math that's like not really as relevant today.
Ooh, tell me some stuff about 17th century math.
Oh, so like favorite things in 17th century math. So I mean, the beginning, it's a dawning of calculus, right?
Yeah.
So you've got Newton. Newton in particular is really, really fascinating. Well, Leibniz and Newton, both of them. So like Leibniz he had this thing called cogitatio caica, blind thought. He really thought that basically we could just let the symbols do all the work, and it doesn't matter if we can visually represent some mathematical concept, or if like it really has a tie to the real world. It was just like, let's go calculate stuff. And with that sort of focus on formalism, he had a lot of development of like thinking about, infinitesimal ratios and some of the mechanisms that go into making differentiation and integration possible that just kind of worked. Newton, on the flip side, kind of started off more on this formal track, but then he was influenced by a bunch of this sort of traditional focus on Greek math that was really prominent in 17th century England. And there they were like, you have to visualize, like it all comes back to geometry. Like geometry started with farmers out trying to measure distances in a field, and like it needs to be grounded. And he grappled a lot with thinking about the gap between a limit and zero, right? And you see that through the Principia. I wrote a paper at one point on his notion of, they called them first and last ratios, which were basically like proto limits. And he kind of held himself back because he was really so focused on keeping things tangible, which I found really interesting between, the two of them. So yeah, one 17th century math tidbit.
Did you kind of continue this line of research in grad school, or was it something else?
I continued the line of research on 17th century math and philosophy in grad school, wrote a dissertation that, 5 people have read on this topic. And then afterwards, basically, with comp lit, so word of the wise for any listeners who decide to be comp lit grad students, there's not a lot of comp lit departments. There's a lot of national language departments. And there's not a lot of ability. Like I think if I'd been able to become a history of philosophy professor, I probably would have stayed in academic, but I was sort of prepared to be like a French literature 18th century professor, 17. And I was like, I don't know if that's really me. And there's not a lot of jobs. So it's like, do I go to Nebraska and fight for my assistant professorship, or do I go into tech? Because I was out at Stanford, so just decided to switch careers. And I think something though that like, what is the humanities training? Is that still with me, besides having arcane knowledge that not many people want to talk about, but I'm glad you do. Normally it's a liability for me at work, because like I get feedback on performance reviews that are like, Catherine's really great, but sometimes she like goes off on these philosophical digressions and we're not really sure why. But I think one thing that I've brought with me is I trained as like an intellectual historian in grad school. And so if you're a philosopher, often today, you're like evaluating arguments for like, is this right? Is this true? And then there's, people come in and say, well, there's no such thing as truth in the first place, everything's relative. I think as an intellectual historian, I didn't care if Descartes was right about, the motion of planets in space. I was really interested in understanding what he thought he was thinking. Like, why this? What was he reading? What was happening around the time? Like, what sort of staying, all right, I'm reading this as a 21st century reader, and I'm coming with all of my prejudices and predispositions of thinking like somebody who's on the internet and viewing the world in a certain way, and thinks that, universal gravitation is second nature, but for him, it was not. So I think there was a lot of training in like suspending disbelief, sort of ensuring that one didn't bring in one's own subjective predispositions, and like really understanding a foreign thinker. And I actually think that's really good training for product management. I think it's really good training for executive work, like, because you're constantly in situations like with a customer, it's not, here's how I want to use my cash flow forecasting app. There's going to be a distribution of millions of customers who are like totally different from me. So I guess I'm always approaching problems from the perspective of like, I'm not going to assume that there's one right answer, and I'm not going to assume that this person thinks is like similar from me or comes from a similar place. And I think that's been really good, like good training in doing product work eventually.
I mean, you didn't just sort of study like any, conflict. It's like, it's very kind of like different technical points of view. And I feel like you see that in ML too, right? Like, I feel like there's this, I had a boss who always said he preferred to hire biologists over physicists. And I think what he meant by that is he liked people that sort of didn't really try to like figure out the underlying structure of models, but just sort of like examine them from the outside of like what they do, right? So like just sort of like take this like kind of open mind, we're not going to make assumptions. But then I think about Newton actually, and it's like, I feel like it seems to me like, you tell me actually, it seems like Newton made this kind of like leap into like a lot of structure, and really, so he must have wanted to put like an underlying structure on the world like really badly to come up with such a, such an amazing structure. And I wonder if, do you think Newton doing ML, it would have driven him nuts that like we kind of have this point of view of like looking at the models from the outside and just examining what they do and maybe not worrying about exactly how they work and making them more and more complicated?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there probably would be aspects of ML that would have driven me crazy. There's other aspects where I think there's some like kinship or, predecessent thinking. So, and I'm influenced here by one of my dear friends and mentors, a man named George Smith. He's a professor at Tufts who, if you really want to know about Newton, like talk to George, like he's the guy. He's taught this course on basically how Newton changed the standards for high quality evidence for like 25 years and really knows a lot on this topic. But one of the things I learned from him is that Newton always assumed that the system that he was trying to model was infinitely more complex than the deductive, mathematical model that he could apply to it. And so there's a lot in sort of the Newtonian scientific paradigm that's like, all right, we're going to put this hypothesis out there, this deductive model, then we're going to make observations, and there's going to be a gap between what we observe and what we've modeled. And the progress of this paradigm is to continuously see where there's to watch that gap and close it when possible, by refining our mathematical model, but sometimes realize where it's just completely off the mark, and we might need to sort of shift our thinking. And so to that extent, I think there's more affinity within sort of the ML mindset than like a sort of traditional like rules-based computer programming mindset, or even the GoFi type mindset, right? And like we can sort of, as long as we can articulate the structure of the thinking, we can model the world.
What is a GoFi type mindset?
Like the good old fashioned AI, these sort of expert systems. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Nice. I didn't know that acronym.
But yeah, I'd say I don't know, it's always been a plight of mine. Like definitely spent a lot of my time in Complit working on rationalist, hyper-structured 17th century thinkers, and drove my Complit colleagues crazy because I kind of came from the math background and my papers were like proofs versus like more exploratory. So I sometimes I envy the ML mindset too, because I think coming from more of that, like always trying to prove things, it's not always the best approach to running a company either, you know. So
do you think Descartes would have had a different point of view on ML?
Okay, so this is another like loose analogy, but basically this whole like, you know, the famous I think therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. He phrased it that way in 1637 discourse on method, which is sort of like he has this like, here's my method, and then he runs it through 3 examples, one of which being the geometry. One was on.
Could you explain what that means? I've heard that a zillion times, but I don't think I know the implication of I think therefore I am.
Yeah. So when he first stated it, what he was trying to do was big, bold 17th century work, prove that God exists, A, but then B, sort of put forth a new way of thinking and doing science that was cleaner and upon which one could actually feel like they had sort of like they could believe these statements and propositions and truths versus the predecessors, which were like always like citing the ancients. So it's like, why is something true? It's true because Aristotle said it was true, versus like it's true because I have used logic to come to a propositional type of truth. So when he was starting his, all right, let's prove that God exists, he says, well, where do I start? Why don't I start by proving that, you know, there's some clear point that I can stand upon where it's like, I know that this is what truth looks like. And so the cogito ergo sum was that point where it was like, basically he's like, no matter how hard I try, if I try to pretend I don't exist, there's got to be somebody there doing that thinking, therefore I must exist. So it's kind of this proof by contradiction. Like, I see. You know, there's got to be some voice there. What's interesting is he rewrote this in his second attempt in it. He got rid of the thinking. So he didn't say cogito. He just said, I am, I exist. And then he said, and if you want to understand how this truth works, he didn't use these words, but, you know, my paraphrase, he's basically like, go sit in a room and meditate for days, like do it, like repeat it and do this for like 30 days. And eventually you will have trained your mind to think clearly. So I looked at that and I was like, well, that's different. That's not quite what I thought Descartes was about. Like go sit in a room and repeat things, you know, until you train your mind to think that way. So that was really interesting to me. And this is a loose analogy, but I think there's something sort of similar to supervised learning. When it's like, is this a dog? Is this a cat? It's just like, show me 50 examples and repeat until it becomes like you've established the input-output pattern. That's not really there, but I think it's kind of there. And I think it's kind of interesting that there's sort of this like intellectual foundation for supervised learning in Descartes. So,
although it seems like with Descartes, it's like there's maybe no input if you're meditating.
There's no input besides your own training your mind to like rewire. It's like rewire your mind to think this way.
I see. You know? I see.
Yeah.
Interesting. Do you then have thoughts on AI being sentient? Like, do you have opinions on, I guess, things like the Turing test, or what are those classic ones that you learned in your first AI class on like the room with the person in it in the books, like doing Chinese or something?
Yeah, the John Searle Chinese room argument.
Yeah.
To be honest, not really. I've always I find the Turing test interesting conceptually, but I struggle to see I struggle with the arguments that are like, the sort of singularity type arguments, like computation is rising and the models are more complex, and these models are going to get to the point where they come into consciousness. I just I don't really see it. Do you? Like, I don't know.
Well, we have this existence proof with humans, right? That seems like consciousness kind of comes from some type of process. So it seems to me like, unless you think there's something really like, something like God in there, in the physics, somehow it sort of must come from like increasingly complicated computation, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I sort of fall into the materialist. While I've spent a lot of time with the 17th century philosophers, I don't share the sense of the soul and there's a God in there that makes things different. Fair enough. Fair enough. But it's interesting. There's still that gap, between, and I don't know if it's the plasticity of our neurons, the fact that there's just thousands of, billions, trillions of very plastic processes going on in there, or if it's like I don't know if you know Dan Dennett type argument where the self is basically a user illusion, right? In the same way that we interface with, I'm looking at you on a Zoom screen right now, my iOS operating system, which makes it easy for me to engage with the computer versus seeing the nitty gritty insides. Maybe it is a useful illusion, that we've gained through evolution, but it's not really real. I kind of buy that argument. So it's basically consciousness is a red herring is kind of what that argument would be.
So are you the kind of person that would get into like a transporter that would like disintegrate your body and reassemble it somewhere else? Would you feel like that's a safe thing to do? there's some very strong opinions on different sides of that at Weights and Biases.
It's a good question. I've never really thought about that. I might change now that I have a son. Now that I'm a mom, if you met me a year ago, maybe I'd say like, yeah, sure. But now it's almost like, would that mean that there's some implication on my relationship to my child? I'm not sure I want that. Yeah.
That's funny. I have a small daughter too, but I think my whole life I would just never get in that machine. To me, it seems incredibly unsafe. I don't know if I can justify it, but I just would not do that. All right. We always end with two questions that are a little more on the practical side, but this is really fun. So what is, I guess, what's a topic in ML that you think is understudied or underappreciated?
So I don't know if it's understudied, but I think it has been underappreciated and now is becoming more appreciated. But this is causal inference. So like the Judea-Pearl do calculus type work. Mm-hmm. This is something we're starting to really look into at the bank because of this need for sort of more interpretable models and lots of conditional probabilities where if we could understand what happens in one variable and how that relates to another variable, it'd be really, really useful for sort of macroeconomic modeling. So it's something that I think it's a topic that a person like me is going to be interested in because it's like philosopher candy as well. Like there's lots of interdisciplinary approaches to this problem. What is a cause? If we can even really define it well, and it's represented formally in machine learning in one particular way. But I think it's going to be interesting over the next couple of years to see these sort of traditional causal inference methods interacting with deep learning in the deep learning community. So that's one thing that I'm personally excited about, but also Borealis is looking into these days.
Interesting. Super cool. Is there like a paper that you could point people to if they were interested in learning more about that?
Yeah. I'll send a link after. There's a paper recently. I know Elias Barenboim, who's one of Pearl's students, and he's at Columbia. He was a co-author. Yashua Bengio is a co-author, and then there's two others that I know less well. That's all about sort of deep learning and causal inference. That's probably a great place to start.
Cool. The final question we always ask, and you've seen so many different applications, I think you'll have a really interesting perspective on this, is basically like kind of going from like wanting to build a model for some purpose and kind of getting it deployed in production, actually doing that purpose. Like, where do you feel like there's the biggest painful or most painful bottlenecks?
Yeah, there's often a lot. Fair to say the most painful. So I think at the highest level, it's really deep integration into the full business process. So, and this is really coming also from an enterprise ML perspective versus like a sort of ML for a software company. But I've seen tons of projects fail where you might have a good, like, given a task, build a model. If it's just handed over to the business without considerations of like, all right, well, where does the production data sit? How do we get that data from that environment to the environment where our model sits to do inference? There's always questions on like just the time frame. Or is this batch, monthly, weekly, real time? Making sure. I've seen stuff where like we think we can easily do a batch output, like it's just monthly, output a set of predictions that are going to go into some call center list. But there's like some nuance in the process where the third week of every month they do this to the data and that's going to mess this up. And so it's always in the details of like what that full flow will look like. And then the third, with the business process is, all right, now you've output the prediction, but how does the process change? Because if people just use it and like they continue to do what they're doing, I don't think you're really taking advantage of right now that we have this, like we can shift our approach. Let's say it's a call center automation thing. Like we can shift the number of people we have on staff at a given time. We can collect the following new data to improve the process in some way. So I think you have to think about it holistically, right? In terms of like, what's the end result? Where does it sit? How do you measure it? So that's kind of all of the production ML pipeline, but I actually think it's all there and like it all matters. So
spoken like someone who's done a bunch of production pipelines, I think. Thank you very much. That's really fun. If you're enjoying these interviews and you want to learn more, please click on the link to the show notes in the description where you can find links to all the papers that are mentioned, supplemental material, and a transcription that we work really hard to produce. So check it out.